The studio smelled of dust and old chemicals, the kind that clung to the back of your throat and made every breath feel borrowed. The photograph lay flat beneath the lamp, its edges curled, its surface faintly speckled like a night sky caught on paper. Two friends stood shoulder to shoulder at the center of the frame, faces turned slightly toward one another, smiles caught mid-breath. The backdrop was a painted wall pretending to be a meadow, a lie everyone once accepted. Their clothes were neat, their posture relaxed, the kind of practiced ease that comes from knowing you will be remembered exactly as you wish. At first, nothing seemed wrong. You could admire the balance of the composition, the soft halo of light around their hair, the careful way the photographer had frozen joy without smearing it. But the longer you looked, the more your eyes were drawn downward, pulled by a quiet insistence you couldn't explain. Their hands were visible, both sets, held at waist level as if they'd been told to stay still and obey. They were holding something, not prominently, not proudly. It was cradled the way people hold a secret, close, casual, almost careless. The object was small, dark, and difficult to name, its edges blurring where the light refused to settle. It didn't cast a shadow the way it should have. It didn't belong to either of them, yet neither seemed surprised by it. Their fingers curved around it with identical tension, knuckles pale, as if whatever it was required two grips to keep from slipping away or waking up. You might have dismissed it as a trick of aging film, a smudge, a reflection, but once seen, it refused to be unseen. The smiles in the photo began to look rehearsed, strained at the corners. The painted meadow behind them felt flatter, thinner, like a stage set about to collapse. And the object in their hands, whatever it was, seemed to press outward, subtly warping the image, asking a question the photograph had been waiting decades for someone to notice. The photograph had been misplaced for so long that its return felt accidental, almost unwilling. It surfaced in a shallow cardboard box at the back of a closed studio, wedged between receipts, cracked negatives, and a brittle appointment book whose dates had faded into ghosts of ink. No one remembered taking it out, yet there it was, resting on top as if it had been waiting for hands to find it again. At first glance, it looked harmless, even charming in a dated way, the sort of image people describe as nice before forgetting it entirely. Two friends stood side by side, close enough that their sleeves touched, close enough to suggest shared jokes and shared years. Their expressions were open, caught in the polite halves, miles people wore when cameras still demanded patience instead of bursts. The studio itself had been unremarkable, a rented space with a painted backdrop and a single window that never quite let in enough light. Many people had stood in front of that same canvas, adopting similar poses, trusting that the camera would be kinder to them than memory ever could be. This photograph followed all the familiar rules: balanced framing, centered subjects, even lighting that softened features without erasing them. The friends looked comfortable, unremarkable in the safest way, the kind of image you might expect to see tucked into an album or slipped into a frame on a mantle. What made it linger, even before anything seemed wrong, was the sense of intention embedded in it. Someone had chosen to keep it. Someone had not thrown it away when studios closed and collections were sold off by weight. The paper was worn but not abused, its edges softened by handling rather than neglect. That alone suggested it had mattered once, that it had been shown, pointed at, maybe laughed over. It carried the quiet authority of an object that had been present during conversations it could no longer repeat. The names of the friends were unknown, scratched nowhere on the back, leaving only their faces to do the work of recognition. They looked like people you might swear you'd seen before, neighbors from another decade, figures who belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Their closeness felt genuine, unperformed, as if the camera had interrupted them rather than commanded them. Nothing about the image announced danger or mystery. It was simply a studio photo of two friends, frozen in a moment that seemed complete, self-contained, finished, as though it had already told its whole story and needed nothing more from anyone who looked at it. The first hint that something was wrong arrived quietly, without drama. the way unease usually does. It came from the hands. Not the faces, not the backdrop, not the familiar stiffness of an old studio pose, but the placement of their fingers and the strange focus the eye kept returning to no matter how often it tried to look away. Both friends held their hands at the same height, angled slightly inward, as if framing something between them. At a distance, it blended into the tones of the photograph, easy to miss, but the longer it was studied, the clearer it became that there was an object there, one that had not been noticed at first, because the mind had refused to give it a name. It did not resemble anything commonly held for a portrait. It was too dark, absorbing light instead of reflecting it, its surface smooth in some places and uneven in others, as if it resisted the rules that made shapes legible. The edges seemed to shift depending on where you focused, sometimes rounded, sometimes sharp, never quite settling into a single outline. What made it unsettling was not its strangeness alone, but the way it interacted with the rest of the image. The lighting that gently illuminated their faces seemed to avoid it, creating a subtle void where highlights should have been. Their grip, too, felt wrong. People holding a shared object usually show difference in pressure or posture. One person leading, the other adjusting. Here, both sets of fingers curved with the same tension, mirroring each other too precisely to be natural. The thumbs rested in identical positions, pressing down as if to keep the object still. There was a faint strain in their hands that didn't match the relaxed expressions above, a contradiction frozen into the frame. As attention settled on that detail, the rest of the photograph began to feel less stable. The smiles started to read as practiced, held a fraction too long. The closeness between the friends felt less like affection and more like necessity, as if space between them would have allowed something to slip. Even the backdrop seemed complicit, its painted scenery flattening into something thin and theatrical, no longer a harmless lie but a deliberate distraction. The most disturbing realization was the sense that the object did not belong to the time the photograph claimed to represent. It felt anachronistic in a way that could not be explained by fashion or forgotten tools. It carried no familiar cultural weight, no hint of purpose or use. The mind searched for comparisons and found none, leaving behind only the certainty that whatever they were holding had not been meant to be seen, and that the photograph, once thought complete, had been quietly hiding this wrongness in plain sight. The discovery of the second photograph happened by accident, the kind that feels guided only after it is too late to pretend it was random. It emerged from a private collection purchased at an estate sale, bundled with portraits of strangers and landscapes that meant nothing to anyone anymore. At first, it seemed identical to the original, the same two friends, the same painted backdrop, the same careful studio lighting that softened their faces. The resemblance was close enough to suggest a duplicate print, the sort that studios often made for clients who wanted more than one copy to give away. Placed side by side, the differences were not immediately obvious. The paper stock was similar, the aging consistent, the corners worn in the same gentle way that suggested years of handling. Even the expressions on their faces matched, smiles frozen at the same angle, eyes caught in the same moment of polite attention. If not for a growing sense of expectation, it might have been easy to dismiss the second photograph as nothing more than a twin. It was the object in their hands that betrayed the lie. In the first photograph, it rested slightly closer to the friend on the left, angled inward as if being offered or shared. In the second, it had shifted. The change was subtle, a matter of centimeters, but unmistakable once noticed. The object now leaned toward the other friend, its position altered just enough to disturb the balance of the image. The fingers that held it had adjusted too, their grip reconfigured in a way that suggested response rather than pose. This alone might have been explained away as a separate exposure taken moments apart, the subjects moving naturally between shots. But the rest of the image refused that comfort. Nothing else had changed, not the tilt of a head, not the fall of a sleeve, not the faint crease in the backdrop behind them. Even the shadows remained stubbornly consistent, as if the studio lights had been locked in place and time itself had hesitated. Only the object had moved, as if it had chosen a different resting place. The more closely the two photographs were compared, the more unsettling the shift became. The object's outline seemed slightly clearer in the second print, its presence more assertive, as though it had edged closer to the surface of the image. The space between the friends felt altered, tightened, no longer symmetrical. It was as if the photographs were not separate moments, but stages in a process, snapshots of something rearranging itself while everything else remained obediently still. What unsettled viewers most was not the movement itself, but the implication that the change had occurred without human involvement, that the object had not been repositioned by hands or time, but had shifted according to its own logic, turning a static portrait into evidence of something that did not stay where it was put as word of the photographs spread among collectors and archivists. The act of studying them began to produce effects that could not be catalogued or dismissed as coincidence. People who spent long hours comparing the images reported small lapses that felt out of proportion to the task at hand. Notes went missing between one reading and the next, sentences ending abruptly as if the thought that had guided the pen had simply stepped away. Dates were misremembered, names confused, not in the chaotic way of exhaustion, but with a precise absence, like a page torn cleanly from a book. One archivist, meticulous to the point of obsession, became convinced he had already examined the photographs months earlier, despite records proving they had only recently entered the collection. He described a lingering sense of familiarity that deepened each time he looked at them, as if the images were restoring memories rather than creating new ones. Another researcher complained of headaches that flared only when focusing on the object in the friend's hands, a pressure that eased the moment his gaze shifted elsewhere. He later admitted he could no longer clearly recall what the object looked like, only the certainty that it had once been obvious. Stranger still were the coincidences that clustered around the investigation. Conversations about the photographs were interrupted by power outages. Phone calls dropped at the exact moment the object was mentioned. Digital scans corrupted without explanation. Attempts to photograph the photographs produced inconsistent results, with the object appearing blurred or overexposed even when the rest of the image remained sharp. It was as if the images resisted being translated into new forms, preferring the limitations of paper and shadow. Those who handled the prints for extended periods reported subtle changes in their own recollections. Childhood memories surfaced uninvited, only to dissolve before they could be examined. Dreams grew vivid and repetitive, featuring hands holding something just out of sight, the weight of it known but its shape refused. Waking brought a faint sense of loss, as though something important had been forgotten during sleep, and taken with it the knowledge of what that thing had been. The most disturbing effect was the shared nature of these experiences. Individuals who had never met described the same gaps, the same moments of disorientation, the same inability to articulate what troubled them about the photographs. It suggested a pattern that did not depend on suggestion or belief, but on exposure. Studying the images did not merely reveal information, it altered the act of remembering itself, blurring the boundary between observer and subject until it became unclear who was examining whom. And what exactly was being taken in the process. The final understanding did not arrive as a revelation, but as a slow inversion, a turning of perspective that made everything already seen rearrange itself into something unbearable. The assumption had always been that the two friends were the subjects and the object was incidental, a strange prop accidentally preserved by chemistry and time. That belief collapsed when someone noticed that in both photographs, the tension in their hands did not align with the object's apparent weight, as if their fingers were reacting to pressure coming from the opposite direction. The grip was not supportive but defensive, the posture of people trying to keep something from tightening rather than slipping free. Re-examined with this in mind, the object's ambiguity took on a different character. Its refusal to be clearly defined no longer felt like a flaw in the image, but a limitation of perception. It was not unclear because it was damaged or poorly lit, but because it was not meant to be fully seen. The more attention paid to it, the less stable it became, as though clarity itself was something it resisted. What had been interpreted as an object held between two people began to resemble a boundary, a point of contact where something else intersected the visible world. The expressions on the friends' faces shifted under this new reading. Their smiles no longer appeared rehearsed for the camera, but strained against it, fixed in place by effort rather than ease. Their closeness read as necessity, bodies aligned not for affection but for balance. The symmetry of their posture suggested coordination, the kind that comes from following instructions that are never spoken aloud. They were not presenting the object to the photographer, they were complying with it. The movement observed between the two photographs reinforced this conclusion. The object had not changed position because time had passed, but because it was adjusting its hold. Each image captured a different stage of that adjustment, subtle enough to escape notice until comparison made denial impossible. The friends were not active participants in that change. Their bodies remained obediently still while something else shifted its grip, testing, settling, learning. What made this realization intolerable was the implication that the photograph was not a record of possession, but of containment. The object was not being held for the sake of the image existed because the object required witnesses, proof of its contact with human hands. The friends were not the owners of what they touched. They were anchors, reference points, evidence that something unseen had reached out and found purchase, and that once held, it did not let go so much as decide how tightly to keep what it had already claimed.